Hello, everyone. It's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Amanda Knox, who spent 4 years in a foreign prison for a crime she did not commit. In the fall of 2007, the 20-year-old college coed left Seattle to study abroad in Italy, but her life was shattered when her roommate was murdered in their apartment. After a controversial trial, Amanda was convicted and imprisoned. But in 2011, an appeals court overturned the decision and vacated the murder charge. Free at last, she returned home to U.S., where she has remained silent until now. I'm reading the script from the back of your book, which I'll show here, which I read. There it is. Okay. Unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. So I see you have an updated version, which includes this will be a surprise to American audiences that the prosecution can appeal their failed conviction or your appeal and acquittal. And so I think that's called double jeopardy in the United States, right?
Yeah, they think of double jeopardy differently over in Italy on the one hand, they have something which is we don't have here, which is easier access to appeals. The opportunity to appeal a conviction and based on the merits of the case as opposed to based on legal shenanigans there's much more of an opportunity to do that in Italy. The flip side of that is both the prosecution and the defense can ask for that appeal. And so acquittals can be overturned in Italy.
Interesting. Yeah, but now that the Supreme Court of Italy has determined that you are free and they cannot try you, there's no chance anything could happen to you, right? You're safe to go there?
That's right. That is correct, yes. That's where their double jeopardy idea comes in. So once the Italian Supreme Court has ruled and made a verdict definitive, it is no longer possible to try the same case. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just, it took 8 years of my life. But yeah. You know what? The same can't be said for many people who are wrongly convicted here in the United States, where it takes decades to overturn a wrongful conviction. So I'm lucky in comparison.
I was just lecturing on your case last night to my Skepticism 101 course at Chapman University, after also lecturing about the Ronald Cotton case, in which he was wrongly accused.
Jennifer Thompson.
Yeah, Jennifer Thompson. Yeah, I met both of them at a conference in Spain, and oh my God, it was so moving. I mean, they're inspiring.
I am just overwhelmed by how inspired both Ronald and Jennifer are, because they both were victims ultimately of the criminal justice system. And it's so beautiful to see that kind of reconciliation happened, because it's so rare in the wrongful conviction community. It honestly is very, very rare that original victims or original victim families reconcile with the wrongfully convicted person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about restorative justice versus retributive justice. The state is not in the business of restoring harms, right? They just enforce the law, that's it. And so it really took, reconciliation between the two of them personally. That's the only way to get to it. Or you sue somebody in civil court, like in the case of the OJ victims. They had to sue him privately because the state of California doesn't care what they lost. They just want to put him away, right? So, yeah, but just for our listeners quickly, because we have a hard out at the hour, is that I don't want to review the details of the case because pretty much everybody knows this. So you were living in Italy, and shortly, just a few months into it, your roommate is murdered. They convict one person. You're also fingered as part of the story, and so you're tried, convicted, sent away to jail on appeal. You're acquitted, and then they retried you and found you guilty, and then on that appeal, it went to the Supreme Court, and you're free. Okay, that's a long time. That was 2007 to 2015, right?
That is correct.
Almost 8 years, yeah. So let's think about it this way. You said, because you mentioned Jennifer was a victim of the criminal justice system. She was also a victim of failed memory and all the cognitive biases that go into this. And this blog post you wrote about the confirmation bias and motivated reasoning and all that applied to your case. I'd really like to expand that for Skeptic Magazine, if I can talk you into that, because it's so important. Because it's not just because in the case of the people working in the Ronald Cotton case, it didn't seem like they were, blatantly racist or whatever. They just made errors, and
Yeah.
And reading your book and watching the Netflix documentary, I just want to scream at that Italian prosecutor. But can we generously say he too was just mistaken? He just got caught up in cognitive biases and his own flawed reasoning and so on?
I mean, that's my interpretation of my prosecutor. And very recently, he actually published a book about his perspective of the case. And obviously, it comes across as very defensive. He spends a lot of time complaining about how he was misrepresented in the media. But I think the more interesting thing for me reading his book and also seeing his interviews in the Netflix documentary about the case was hearing him talk about the moments that were really key to him understanding the facts of the case that he used to interpret his decision making or to justify his decision making. And one of those things was from like his first judgment before he even set foot in the house to examine the crime scene was that the break-in, so someone broke into my house and raped and murdered my roommate. He said that that was faked. He was just convinced from the get-go without a second thought that that was a staged burglary. It wasn't a real burglary. And that set him up with an anchoring bias that prevented him from imagining that it possibly could be someone who broke into our home. And from there, he logically followed that very false premise to its logical conclusion, which is that someone who lived in the house was involved in the crime. And of all of my roommates, I was the most convenient target. So
Right.
that's an interesting one for me. And why he decided that that must be true, I mean, I think people are really good at finding retroactive justifications for their gut instincts ultimately. But I think that that was just a wrong assumption that he made. And I think his years of being a law enforcement officer and detective made him trust his instinct, his gut instinct, implicitly and without question. And that led him down his tunnel vision and his confirmation bias. And it didn't allow him the opportunity to question himself.
Right. So then you have these kind of subjective intuitions you mentioned. For example, Meredith's body was covered in a blanket. And he blurts out something like, well, only a woman would cover the victim with a blanket. A guy wouldn't do that. How do you know? I mean, is there some data set you have?
Where is the data set? Yeah, no, it's surprising to me how many judgments that people make in their lives just based upon their own personal feelings and not and again, it's fascinating to see people retroactively justify what ultimately comes down to an impulse, a feeling. And for him, he just thought that was the kind of gentle touch that only a woman could bestow. But, conveniently, the only people who lived in that apartment were women. And so if he was thinking that somebody in the apartment was involved, maybe his mind, consciously or unconsciously, was trying to find confirmation that someone in the house, a woman, was involved in what ultimately is typically a very male crime, a rape and a murder. So.
Right. And then having to spin doctor the counterfactuals that don't fit the story. So, how is it that the real perpetrator's DNA was all over the place, but yours wasn't?
Right.
Well, so they're operating on the assumption, well, we know she was involved. So they must have cleverly wiped up all their DNA and somehow missed his DNA. How would you even see your DNA? I mean, none of this. How is it a prosecutor at that level cannot know that basics about DNA?
Yeah, it's frustrating. And in fact, a friend of mine named Michael Olshacker, who has written books with John Douglas, he's famously said that if it were possible for me to accomplish what the prosecutor in this case said, which is that I miraculously cleaned up all traces of my DNA, but left the brutal crime scene intact with all of the other people's DNA at the crime scene, I deserve the Nobel Prize in chemistry because it is literally impossible. And I'm just, again, it's fascinating for me to see the various ways that people find excuses to confirm what they already believe, even when it flies in the face of common sense.
Right. So you talk about, you start off on your different cognitive biases here, the anchoring bias, the tendency to rely on the first piece of information, regardless of its validity. So last night, I have these class participation things where, for example, you write down the last two digits of your social security number, and then you estimate something. Doesn't matter what it is. People with high last two digit numbers put a higher number, lower number. If they have a lower number, it just has nothing to do with it, right? So that's one of the classic Tversky-Kahneman anchoring bias ones. Or
I love these little tricks and tests that we've come up with just to prove that our brains aren't working right. I love it.
Right. Well, yeah. So there's an interesting debate in cognitive psychology. To what extent are we naturally irrational, or are we actually mostly pretty rational, but get it wrong when other things intervene? Some of these heuristics, as they're called, these rules of thumb that we just use, because who has time to cut through all the logic for every single thing you do, right? So, therefore, the anchoring thing, right? So a restaurant on a menu will put a really expensive bottle of wine to nudge you up to the higher one rather than the medium one or lower one, something like that, right? I mean, people are not even, aware of this, that they're doing this. And oftentimes the first piece of information you get may be helpful, right? Or the first hypothesis you form. The problem is it's not natural to kind of think in a Bayesian way. Well, I'm going to update my priors and keep an open mind, and I'll keep my credence at around 50% until I get enough information. That's not normal.
No, it is not. And I'm thinking that even prior to arriving at the crime scene, my prosecutor was carrying with him all of his prior context, all of the cases that were already in his mind. And, famously, one of the really big cases that he looked into was the Monster of Florence case, which was taking place in the heart of the Satanic Panic. It was this gruesome serial killer thing that was going on that was very sexualized and very violent. And I can't help thinking that one of the original thoughts he had about this case, which was that it was satanic in origin or in motivation, derived from all of those priors that he brought into the equation, even though there was no evidence whatsoever of anything religious or satanic or ritual happening in Meredith's case.
It's the details of the narrative story that throws people off. Let me give you an example of this that I used in this lecture. Let me see here. Okay, what's more likely? A nuclear weapon will be launched before 2024, or a nuclear weapon will be launched before 2024 by North Korea following a breakdown of talks and a military attack against North Korean targets, which Kim Jong-un mistakes for an all-out invasion. Okay, most people think, well, the second one, obviously.
Yeah.
but the answer is no.
One.
It can't be. Just logically, it's impossible, right? Because the more details you get, the lower the likelihood that hypothesis is true.
Absolutely.
This is called the conjunction fallacy. And this is what I was thinking with your case is, so they got the real guy, the real killer. Now let's add some more elements. In addition to that, there's this person and that person, and they had this whole sex thing going on, sex triangle, well, this crazy stuff. The more details they put in, the less likely it is to be true, but that isn't how people reason.
Right. Yeah, and I think what complicated this in my case is that before they knew who the actual murderer was, they had already arrested me, my boyfriend, my boss. And so they were faced with a problem when finally they got the fingerprint evidence back, the DNA evidence back, and it all pointed to this local burglar that they knew about. They had to decide whether or not he was the sole killer, as the evidence suggested, or if they were completely wrong in arresting these three innocent people and they needed to admit fault. And I think that a lot of people look at that moment as being the moment that shows that there was amazing corruption in the case. Like they knew then that they had the wrong people. So why did they persist in this prosecution? Why did they come up with this crazy theory to get a bunch of strange people who didn't know each other into a room murdering somebody together? And I'm still thinking that was, once again, an opportunity of bias, because we're looking at the conservatism bias where, instead of thinking you're on the wrong track, you twist your previous conception of the case to fit everything that you want to fit into it, and you don't have to revise your beliefs based on new evidence. You're stuck in tunnel vision. And the number of times you see that in the United States is fascinating. Like there are times in the US where there are like these horrible rapes and murders, and they finally test the DNA, and it turns out it wasn't the person who they originally convicted. And instead of admitting, oh no, we got the wrong person, what they say is, oh, there's just a co-ejaculator in the rape. There is somebody else who was who raped and murdered her. So there was a collaborator, but that person just didn't happen to be indicted. They're the unindicted co-ejaculator, the one whose DNA was actually left at the crime scene, even though we know that this guy did it. His DNA not being there doesn't mean anything. Like the ways that we try to be right in the face of overwhelming evidence, and really put up obstacles to innocent people being released from prison is pretty shocking when you actually look at how it plays out.
Co-ejaculator, was that an actual term they used?
Oh, absolutely. The unindicted co-ejaculator. You hear about that all the time if you go down the wrongful conviction rabbit hole.
Okay, one last example on this conjunction fallacy. This is called the Linda problem. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but
I have not.
Okay, so this is a kind of 1980s narrative. But so subjects are to read this narrative and then ask a question about it. Linda is a 31-year-old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more probable? Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Okay, and as you're going to guess, everyone goes, oh, it's got to be the second one. Read the narrative. She's a feminist. She's an activist. You can't be both a bank teller and a feminist as more likely than just a bank teller, right?
Absolutely.
And so the more detail, but so Kahneman and Tversky's interpretation of this is this representativeness fallacy, that the story turns people's heads because it makes it seem like it represents the category, the fuzzy set, the thing we're thinking about. Like, so the story that was told about you from your MySpace, that's how long ago that was, nicknamed Foxy Noxy. Okay, so she's, and she had sex 7 different times. I mean, it's just astonishing to me that they would dig out your sexual history or force that out of you or whatever. But that's part of the thing, right? Okay, so now let's say what could be. And then they just start making shit up. And there's no evidence for any of this. There's no base rate evidence for what, women who've had sex 7 times are more likely to kill their sex partners or any, just right. Whatever. But to a jury, I could kind of see, yeah, all right, the more details they put in, the more representative it seems of what you sitting there in the courtroom, it looks like.
Right. And the more different ways that they hear it too, like there are just countless words that were used to describe me in the courtroom. It wasn't just enough that I was a person and accused of a crime. I was a satanic, drug-addled, depraved she-devil. I was Foxy Noxy. I was Luciferina. I was called a man-eater. I was called a femme fatale. I was called an adulteress. You hear all these words just thrown at you without any context, but it grabs the attention of a jury because they understand those terms in the context of the narratives that they've experienced in their own lives. And so they can project their own experiences onto this blank slate of a person that I happen to be. I think this also relates to the salience bias, where people have the tendency to ignore unremarkable ideas or information as opposed to striking ones. So when you throw ideas out there like femme fatale and drug addict and, odd, and they sort of land on all these moments where I was described as having odd behavior, and they really emphasize, they put like great explanatory, weight to, Amanda was seen outside the crime scene cuddling her boyfriend. That must mean that she was just so sexually charged that she couldn't keep her hands off him, even in light of this like horrible crime that had occurred. Instead of interpreting it in light of an innocence claim, which is, I was scared. I didn't know what happened. Like, lots of horrible, I was kicked out of my home because my home was now a crime scene and my boyfriend was trying to comfort me. Like, I think that the bias towards interpreting things that have an innocent explanation for the sake of having this like striking narrative explanatory weight definitely leans in that favor because it's more narratively interesting.
Yeah. We were just watching that big trial last week in North Carolina or South Carolina. I forget the guy's name now, but at any rate, he didn't act the way he should have if he was really grieving. He looks like he's acting the way he would have if he shot them. How does anybody have any idea how they would react if their roommate was murdered? I mean, I have no idea.
That's
what's
the
normal?
Alex Murdoch case.
Alex Murdoch, that's it. Yeah.
And I haven't actually followed that case closely, but what I do know is that there, once again, as with many of these cases, there are all these YouTube channels where people are basically expressing themselves as behavioral experts who are looking at his trial testimony and are deciding based upon these subtle cues that they can read into his true nature. And I feel like that is our desperate need to understand something that is very difficult to understand, which is why somebody would murder their wife and child. And I think we are looking for patterns. We are pattern seekers where patterns are not reliable at the very least, because human beings react in all kinds of ways and their reactions to anything can change minute by minute. To give an example just from my own case, like in the days leading up to my arrest, there were 4 days. I called the police when I found out my home was turned into a crime scene. 4 days later, I was arrested. And a lot of that was based upon what the police say was my behavior. They said that she was acting like a guilty person. They said that I was either not crying enough or I was, saying things in a weird way. And I wasn't fluent in Italian, so I was trying to communicate with them in a language that I was not fluent in. But furthermore, depending on what time of day and what was being asked of me, I was emoting in a very different way. Sometimes I was shocked and I was sort of in dead possum mode. Other times I was angry. Other times I was crying. Other times I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, I'm so lucky to be alive right now. If I had been home, I would have been murdered too. So, of course, framing comes into play. If I'm crying and you assume that I'm guilty, then people look at that as either crocodile tears, I'm putting on a show, or as a sign of some deep guilt coming out of me. Or if I'm not crying, then they interpret that as me being cunning and cold and unfeeling and psychotic. So really, once again, how we react to a given situation, it's so hard to interpret that in a reliable way from the outside.
Yeah, I know that behavior panel you were talking to, the body language guys. And I've talked to them. I find it's very amusing and entertaining to watch. But I've been pressing them to test them, right? So most of theirs is hindsight bias, right? Okay, we got Lance Armstrong. Here's a video. We know he lied. We know he doped. So, and now let's watch him give this testimony. And you can see he's using the thumb and he's looking away and he's doing this. It's or Clinton, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky. Oh, look, he looked to the right and then he set his Coke can down this way. Oh, all clearly signs of deception. In blind tests, people do really no better than 50-50 chance on guessing whether someone's lying or not. It's really, really difficult. And that's true with most of these CSI shows. You see, I gave a talk at a conference once of these CSI type scientists or sort of scientists, whatever, investigators, and
forensic
bite marks.
Examiners,
forensic examiners, right? So the bite marks. I said, all right, so do you have some experiment where you have 100 different bite marks and then 100 different teeth, and you have subjects who know nothing about anything try to match them, and they're like, no. Well, then how do you know it works? And the answer is, well, it's It reminds me of Moneyball. Before the in Moneyball, it's like these scouts are using their intuitions about what these players are, why these players are succeeding and not. My favorite example was the one, he's like, well, have you seen his girlfriend? She's not very good looking. This is why his self-esteem is so low. It's like, what?
God, wow. Yeah, I mean, to your point of being able to test the body language experts, I mean, I'd love to know if they have examined wrongfully a wrongful convictions case where it was proven through DNA that the person was actually innocent. It'd be really interesting to see, or to test somebody based on that. Say like, oh, here is an example of somebody who was convicted of a crime, and then have them do all the body language examination and then inform them afterwards whether or not the person was proven innocent through DNA. It sounds like something, I mean, if you wanted to team up with Dr. E.T.L. Dror, who I know that you're familiar with, who studies, he studies specifically cognitive bias in forensic pathology.
Oh, I don't know him.
Recently, oh yeah, he's fantastic. He does a lot of really good testing of how cognitive bias plays into forensic science. His first most famous one was about fingerprint analysis, and so he gave a bunch of fingerprint experts this old cases that they had already examined a long time in the past, but gave them in a new context. So a lot of information about the perpetrator, whether or not they confessed, what their race was, what their age was. He just basically changed everything about the case except the fingerprints, and then asked them to examine the fingerprints and say if they matched or not. And of course, classically, they completely changed their expert opinion on what should have been a very non-subjective, objective analysis of fingerprints. He's done that same thing with DNA experts, where he's asked them to re-examine, unbeknownst to them, previous cases that they looked into, but with new contexts. And most recently, he's looked into forensic pathology, where people are given information from an autopsy and are asked to determine whether or not the person was murdered or died accidentally. And only based upon extraneous information, he gave them the same autopsies, but different information about the person, whether or not it was a black or a white victim, whether or not it was the grandmother who brought in the child or the mother's boyfriend who brought in the child, completely changed their determinations about whether or not it was murder or whether or not it was a accidental death, which is shocking when you really, really think about it. Like, if something is determined to be a murder instead of an accidental death, suddenly that is a crime. And the person who brings in the victim is immediately assumed to be the perpetrator. And suddenly the criminal justice system becomes involved. So there are real consequences to this idea that scientists are completely objective in their examinations and aren't at all influenced by extraneous information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the problem there is, so I would do it blind, right? Maybe have present the body language panel guys with 10 different cases, all mixed up. They would have no idea who is who. They'd just be, numbered. 5 who were convicted and rightfully convicted. We know they did it. And then 5 who were wrongfully convicted. They've been exonerated through the Innocence Project, something like that. And show them 10 different video clips. Here's the guy doing his whatever interview with the detective or something like that. Line them up. Go ahead and tell us which ones. I would bet my house they couldn't do it better than just random guessing. Now, I know they're confident they could, but I'm not so sure.
Well, what's really interesting is a lot of, especially in this, there was a lot of controversy around Dr. E.T.L. Dror's latest sort of research into forensic pathology. And a lot of forensic pathologists argued back that, well, of course, race and the relationship between the victim and the individual who reported the wounds or whatever, of course that's relevant to our determination. And I think the question that is a really honest question that forensic pathologists and human beings in general should really ask themselves is, what information do you actually need in order to make your objective scientific determinations? And this is why Dr. Eteldror has advocated for something called linear sequential unmasking. For instance, it is not important for a fingerprint expert to know whether or not the suspect confessed or not, right? Like that is not relevant to the scientific process. And yet it is shown that if you tell, fingerprint experts that a suspect has confessed to a crime, they're much more likely to determine that a fingerprint is a match versus not. So I think we need to really accept that bias is, here's the thing, it's not conscious. So many of us are not consciously thinking, well, of course, if he confessed, then I'm going to change my, forensic opinion. But it's unconscious. It's happening whether we like it or not. And so we need to take responsibility for what kinds of information we are bringing in to our objective examinations of evidence.
Mm-hmm. I just met a psychologist at Cal State Fullerton when I was visiting last week who studies why people make false confessions. I had no idea there was like a body of literature on this, but it was super interesting. It reminded me of your case when I was listening. How did they get that out of you? So much depends on how that interrogation is conducted. And, there's supposedly rules about this. You can't just lock the person up for 3 straight days like a cult, right? And beat them and yell at them and scream at them like, this isn't Abu Ghraib. But the way you were treated, it was like Abu Ghraib. Like, and
there are surprising loopholes, right? Like, so you're right that, common sense would make us think, no, you can't just hold an innocent person and, keep them from talking to their family members or to legal counsel. And there are lots of, don't we have rules to protect innocent people? And I think the really interesting thing that I've come to understand through the research of especially experts like Professor Saul Kassin out of John Jay University, who's a leading expert in coercive interrogations, is the loopholes and the lies that are presented to individuals who are under interrogation. One of those loopholes that they get away with is they say, well, it wasn't an interrogation. We were just interviewing the subject. So they'll say, oh, because it's an interview, you're not technically a suspect, and therefore you're not entitled to certain rights. You're just a person of interest. So we don't have to tell you that you are entitled to an attorney. We don't have to tell you that anything you say can and will be used against you. We don't have to tell you that, for me, even, I remember one of the things that my prosecutor said was, well, Amanda was free to leave at any time during her interview. She wasn't even a suspect. She was free to leave at any time. But that was never communicated to me. I was in a closed room surrounded by police officers who were interrogating me very aggressively, yelling at me, hitting me. At no point did I think, oh, of course I'm a free person. I'm allowed to go. Another one of the ways that they'll use these loopholes is they'll say, okay, again, because you're a witness and not a suspect, we don't have to record the interrogation. It's an interview. We can't just record all of our interviews. Do you know how many resources we'd have to put towards recording every single interview we ever do? So then transparency goes out the window because no one can review what was actually said in that space. And it is used against people in court. It's just their word against the suspects. So, yeah, lots of loopholes to get away with psychological bullying.
Let's talk about self-deception and maybe how false confessions, the person actually does come to believe it through some techniques. I was thinking about the recovered memory movement in the 90s, where these mostly adult women were seeing therapists, these kind of Freudian therapists who believe that a great many people are sexually molested as children, way more than actually are, and that they repress the memory of it because it's so traumatic. Now this adult woman is seeing the therapist for whatever, anxiety or depression or sleep disorders, whatever. And they go, well, these symptoms represent people who were molested as children. Do you think you were? Oh, no, I wasn't. Well, I know you don't think you were, but are you aware that people repress these memories? Oh, no, I didn't know about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, 3 months later, seeing the therapist once a week, they have this recovered memory. Oh my God, I've suddenly realized my father molested me, grandfather, whatever. And there were people actually tried and convicted and put in prison for this until some of the people started suing these therapists, and that put an end to it fairly quickly. But
yeah, there was a lot of that during the Satanic Panic, where, again, there was all of this hysteria around child molestation, very conveniently after a lot of women were really flooding into the workplace and, giving their children or entrusting their children to childcare facilities. Like, suddenly there's this backlash. Oh, all these childcare facilities are leading to the kids are getting, sexually abused, and they're doing satanic rituals. And so I'm familiar with that research. I've mostly read from Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who's really looked at this
Elizabeth,
great stuff.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, when we're talking about the interrogation techniques, they're very, very similar. And we're talking about, like, I believe Saul Kassan identified 3 different kinds of false confessions. There's, just coerced false confessions where the person knows that they didn't do it. They just say they did it because they're exhausted. They think, I'll just say what they want me to, or they want me to say, so they'd stop yelling at me. They let me go. They let me talk to an attorney, and then the evidence will come out that proves that I'm innocent. Then there was another one, but then the one that you're speaking of is internalized, what he calls internalized false confessions, where the person genuinely starts to believe what the police are telling them. And very similar to these therapists who are offering who are suggesting the possibility of repressed memory, that is exactly what police are suggesting to innocent people who are under a high stress situation, and where the police are not willing to accept any other answer from that person. So in my own case, for example, the police were basically told me, look, there's 2 explanations for what's going on. Either you are lying to us, and you are knowingly lying to us because you are involved in the murder and you are guilty and you're never going to see your family again and you're going away to prison, or you're innocent and you just experienced something so traumatic that you can't remember it anymore. So here's the deal. We need you to remember this very traumatic thing so that you can show us that you're cooperating with us. And that's the situation that was presented to me. And at a certain point, when you have been put under high stress, it was in the middle of the night for me. I was sleep deprived. I was scared. I didn't have access to my family. I didn't have access to an attorney. I started to believe that the only reason why the police would be treating me this way is because they must know something that I don't know. I must be traumatized. I was already traumatized. Let's be real. I never expected to come home and find my house a crime scene. And so I caved. Consciously or unconsciously, I started to think, oh my God, what if I did witness something and I have no memory of it? What if that's really true? And I was lied to. The police told me that they had evidence proving that I was present at the crime scene when it occurred. And the only explanation that I could think of that made sense in that moment was what they were suggesting to me, that I just couldn't remember it.
Astonishing. Yeah. Years ago, I did a show on lie detection for this Fox Family show called Exploring the Unknown. And we did one on lie detection, a 2-parter on lie detection. First, the body language stuff, but also the polygraph. Anyway, so we got this guy, Doug Williams from Oklahoma City, who was now working for defense attorneys to show that the polygraph is a bunch of bullshit. But he also showed how to beat it if you have to do it. But he had this funny story about, you want to know how you do it? This is hilarious. We couldn't say this on the air, but he told me privately. So on the baseline questions, the whole point is there's a difference between the baseline questions and the relevant questions, and you spike because you're anxious or whatever. He says, so just squeeze your anal sphincter muscle on the regular, normal questions, and that'll spike your blood pressure. So I tried it. I'm all hooked up and I'm like, and so sure enough, my blood pressure is going way up. I'm like, holy crap. Yeah. Anyway, but he had a funny story, like when he learned to do the polygraph, working for the Oklahoma City police, and they taught him how to do it, and he had to practice it. And they go, okay, we got an actual suspect here. Go in there and do the test and tell us what you think. So he does the test, comes back. Well, boss, I think he's probably lying. They go, we know he's lying, Williams. Get in there and get the confession. He goes, what? He goes, yeah, just tell him we got his fingerprints and 3 eyewitnesses, and in addition to the polygraph. What?
Wow.
And what's the rationale? we know this guy did it, but if he didn't, he did something like this. He's one of these bad dudes. They're going to get off on some technicality and commit another crime. So we're doing our job by putting this guy away, even if he didn't do it. What the hell? I was astonished to hear this.
Yeah, I think what's astonishing is, especially with how we've been told law enforcement thinks and how much they care for following the rules. And we've seen that in, the X-Files and every single show where the police procedural show. We see good guys who are doing the right thing. And when they do the wrong thing, it's for the right reasons. And so for some reason, we empathize with that. And we even root for them when they break the rules for the right reasons. But fundamentally, those rules are there for a very important reason, which is that human beings are flawed. And we can't trust them to always know what the right thing to do is and what is actually true. So I think that the shift in the narrative is really important for having a more safe and reliable justice system. I think the other thing that would really matter is, and you brought up, restorative justice versus retributive justice at a while ago in our conversation, is relying less on law enforcement to deal with the harm that happens in society. Because another thing that happens when we are in a retributive system that relies heavily upon the police proving the person did it and getting them to go to prison is all of those cases where people have been victimized and they can't prove it. And and they're suffering nonetheless. And nobody's offering anything to support them. Even when victims can prove that they've been victimized and they get the right guy, what they're offered in terms of society giving back to them is punishing the perpetrator, not at all offering them some kind of support, some kind of acknowledgement that they need. Like, the acknowledgement is, we're going to severely punish this criminal. We're not going to address your needs. And I think that it's this false idea that somehow punishment is addressing the needs of the harmed person. And I think that is really flawed and doesn't actually bear out in people's lived experiences.
I think I heard you talking about the woman in the Roman Polanski case. Somewhere you wrote about it or something, where she has been telling the state of California for decades, just drop it. I don't want it to be involved in this. And the state of California it's none of your business. This is our problem.
Exactly. Yeah. Samantha Geimer, I interviewed for my podcast Labyrinths, and she has this wonderful, this very fascinating but inconvenient perspective for the law enforcement and even victims' rights side of things, which equates victims' rights with prosecution. And for her, that was as a victim, as a very clear victim of sodomy, of rape, as a 13-year-old girl, the last thing that she wanted was to go through a very public trial when really all she wanted was there to be an acknowledgement between her and her perpetrator and for there to be some kind of restoration of the harm that was done to her. The last thing that she wanted to be was paraded around in a trial that was going to make the careers of some prosecutors and judges. And for decades, she's been told that her opinion doesn't matter, that her perspective, if she asks for mercy, then they don't want to hear it. And it's fascinating to me that prosecutors want to put victims in a position of making impact statements at sentencing hearings, but only if they're asking for a harsher sentence, never if they're asking for mercy. So there are a lot of victims and victim family members, groups that are trying to change that perspective and show that not every victim is demanding punishment as a way of satisfying their pain. There's the Families Against Death Penalty groups, and I think that is what the restorative justice system is attempting to address, is the fact that victims are genuinely empowered to have a role in healing the harm that was done to them and done to society, instead of being relegated to this pawn of the prosecution.
Yeah, so I'm a little guilty of what I would do if I was there while listening to your book, screaming into the ether as I'm riding my bike listening to this. asshole prosecutor that is like, I want to punch this guy. Well, if they would have been yelling at me like this, I would have said, fuck off, assholes. Or
you and
does
my
this work
stepdad.
But, if I'm 20 and I haven't slept in 3 days and my roommate was murdered and I'm locked in this room with these idiots yelling at me, I'm not sure I would have had the fortitude to do that. How did you, come to grips with that? How did you not just scream into their faces, leave me alone? Or, how does that work?
A big factor was, again, I was 20. My background was that I grew up in the suburbs of Seattle. I implicitly trusted police. And so even when they started becoming aggressive with me, instead of thinking, oh, they're behaving in a way that isn't correct, I interpreted what they were doing as a sign that something was my fault. And at first I thought it was the fact that I wasn't understanding them correctly, or I wasn't speaking the language correctly. Again, this was all in a foreign language that I couldn't really speak very well and couldn't understand. And so originally I thought that they were frustrated with me and they kept asking me the questions over and over again because I was failing them in some way and they were frustrated with me. I genuinely wanted to help them. And so my own bias came into play and I decided to interpret all of their actions towards me as being completely justified. And so I internalized a lot of blame, and I've had to, and as a consequence, also internalized a lot of shame. And a lot of people who have been through a course of interrogations have felt that way, have grappled with the shame of it afterwards and feeling blamed for something that ultimately wasn't their fault and in a situation that was not in their control. And that's one of the most important lessons that I took away from Professor Saul Kassen's work, was that there is a systematic process for breaking down an individual's defenses, even when they're innocent in these kinds of scenarios. And the only people who actually have agency in the interrogation room are the interrogators, never the person who is interrogated. And that's why police interrogations are so effective, because they are effective at getting guilty and innocent people to confess alike.
Have you restored matters with the prosecutor? Have you met with him?
That is a really good question, and I would love to answer it, but I can't at this time.
Oh, okay. This is the follow-up for your next book.
Yes, just stay tuned is what I'll say to that.
That would be an interesting story. At the very least, a feature-length magazine article, but if not, another book in this context of restorative justice. What about Meredith's family?
So I've not ever had a direct contact with Meredith's family, unfortunately. I have reached out through various channels to communicate to them that I would love to talk to them. I have not received a response, and I try not to press it. And in fact, I'm honestly always a little bit uncomfortable to answer a question like that because I don't want people to think that I'm putting pressure on them to respond. I know that they have a lot of trauma to unpack before they can even consider the fact of my innocence. And I don't take that lightly. I know that there's a lot of things going against me in their mind's eye. And so I take that seriously. I respect that. And I understand that it's a very rare and special thing for original victims' family members to reconcile with the wrongly convicted.
Is it possible they still think you were involved somehow?
I mean, it's possible. They certainly were fed a whole bunch of baloney at the very beginning of this case. And it's, again, that anchoring bias, especially when that anchoring bias comes into a person's life when they have experienced a very traumatic incident. Those kinds of information really take root. And I do not envy them the task of having to unpack and unravel all of the misinformation that they were given at a very, very crucial and determining moment of their lives.
It may not be possible for them to create a new memory, like back to the Jennifer and Ronald Cotton case. She was so sure he was the rapist that when they showed her Bobby Poole, whose DNA was there, they got him. He's the guy who did it. She just could, but that's not him.
Right.
I know. And so what happened to the original memory? it's gone.
Right.
The wrong guy is the memory,
Right.
and you can't change it. It's gone.
Absolutely.
And that may be the case. They just can't erase that and put a new one in there.
Yeah. And you know what? Like, I don't blame them for that. Like, that's a really, really hard thing to deal with. And so I'm not, sitting here holding my breath, waiting for them to reach out to me. But I do hope that one day some kind of understanding and just an opportunity for mutual grief is possible, because, their lives and my life were completely turned upside down and redefined by this shared grief, this shared trauma. And we experienced it in different ways, but I think that it all stems from the same root cause, and we have that in common. So I hope one day that that's possible.
I hope so. That would be good. Okay, last couple things before you got to go. Why was your case so famous? I mean, you are one of the most famous people in the world. There's millions of murders every year, or whatever the numbers, hundreds of thousands. Why yours? Is it, and one thought I had was because sex is involved and people lose their minds over sex. They just can't even reason.
There are a lot of sex crimes that happen in the world too.
That's true. Yeah.
So I think that part of it was the timing, right? Like, social media was really coming into itself at the time that my case was in the public eye. I think there were a lot of economic pressures happening in the world of journalism that led to a lot of lazy reporting that then got rehashed in social media. I think that another aspect of it is, you're right, it was a sexualized crime. And the fact that it was a woman who was accused of the rape and murder of another woman, this is going to sound crude. I think it played into a lot of people's sexual fantasies.
Oh, yeah.
I think that there absolutely was a pornographic element to it that spoke to people's fears and fantasies. And so, yeah, I think the combination of the economic pressures on, traditional journalism, coupled with social media, Facebook, Twitter, gaining traction in 2007, 2008, 2009, the international scope of it, the sexualized, good girl gone bad sex crime that people were intuitively, jerking off to. That was, I think all of that played into how this case became so big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. If you just Google your name and just put comma headlines, that Foxy Knoxy thing with your picture, it's just, there must be 10,000 images like that. It's
absolutely. And the fact that there was always constantly pressure coming from journalists towards people who are in this like small community, law enforcement community, to leak information. And so there was this constant leaking of information mixed in with misinformation. There was a lot of flip-flopping. It made the case very dramatic and interesting to follow. And it became overly transparent, because any random thing that came across the police's inquiries ended up becoming a headline. And of course, it was 8 years of trial that involved 2 guilty convictions and 2 acquittals, and it was just. It was a roller coaster to experience personally, and I think a roller coaster for people as followers, as people who were entertained.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last question. I see this all as a signal detection problem. We want to get hits. We want to correctly identify the true criminal, and we want to avoid fingering innocent people. We want to let them go. And so we make 2 kinds of errors: type 1 error, where you false positive, and a type 2 error where you miss the real criminal, let him go. Right. So let's say Attorney General Garland calls you and says, Amanda, we want to reform the criminal justice system. We're getting too many false positives. What should we do?
Ooh, God. Okay, so
there's your next book.
I know. There's so much to unpack here, but I think the thing that I personally have always really looked for change is in the interrogation room. So making what happens in the interrogation room more transparent, recording and video recording all interviews and interrogations. We have the technology at this point. Change the rules so that police can't blatantly lie to suspects. Like, put all of those things contribute to false confessions, and false confessions are devastating in an innocent person's case. I think when it comes to forensics, I would say Dr. E.T.L. Dror has made tons of wonderful suggestions about, again, this linear sequential screening that limits experts' knowledge on extraneous information that is not actually going to help them make objective findings. And then I think another thing that would be interesting is to reevaluate relationships that prosecutors have with judges. One of the things that I was startled to learn is that very typically judges come from their career path is first they are law enforcement, then they are prosecutors, then they become judges. And so you don't see it being as often that defense attorneys become judges. It's not typically the career path. And so defense attorneys don't have the same kind of cozy, intuitive relationship with judges that prosecutors do. I also think one thing that's kind of odd in our country that I've seen is that judges who are a part of original convictions are supposed to be the judges of the appeals trial. So they're supposed to somehow evaluate whether they themselves were biased and unfair to the defendants who are appealing to them. And I think it's obvious that we should have different judges evaluating whether or not that is the case, because then we avoid automatic defensiveness. And then, of course, I think obviously the death penalty is irrational and morally corrupt. So we should absolutely abolish the death penalty.
Yeah, I do think it's on death row. Hopefully it hasn't died quite as quickly as I would have liked, but yeah, for sure. Yeah, that was great, Amanda. Thank you so much. I have to have you on again. I wanted to talk about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning after his experience in Auschwitz, to ask you, is there anything you can say? Yeah, this is what I got out of this, what I learned about human nature.
Yeah, we need a whole other podcast to do that. So let's schedule that.
All right, we'll do that. All right, sounds good.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you.